In 1929, in a dusty old palace in Istanbul, someone pulled out a fragment of gazelle skin that had been gathering dust for centuries. On it was a map, hand-drawn in 1513, more than 500 years ago, and when scholars looked closely, they froze. Because this map, supposedly, showed things its maker could not possibly have known. Coastlines no European had sailed, a continent that wouldn't be officially discovered for 300 more years. It looked, for all the world, like a map of places before anyone had found them. And it's not the only one. Scattered through history are maps that seem to show too much. Lands drawn before explorers reached them. Coastlines sketched before any ship is recorded sailing there. So what's going on? Did ancient sailors reach these places first? Was there a lost civilization that mapped the world and vanished? Did someone, somehow, know? Today we're going to look at the most famous of these impossible maps and unravel what's really behind them. And I promise you, the true explanation is in some ways even stranger and far more human than the myths. Let's start with that map from Istanbul. The map is called the Piri Reis map, named after the Ottoman admiral who drew it in 1513. And to be clear from the start, it is a genuinely remarkable document. One of the oldest surviving maps to show the Americas, drawn just 2 decades after Columbus first crossed the Atlantic. Only a fragment survives, about a third of the original, inked onto gazelle skin. And on it, the coast of West Africa and the bulge of Brazil are drawn with real, surprising accuracy for the time. That part is impressive, but not mysterious. Piri Reis openly said he compiled his map from many older source maps, including, by his own account, one made by Columbus himself. He was a brilliant collector and synthesizer of the best knowledge available. But then there's the bottom of the map. Down at the southern edge, the coastline of South America bends sharply and runs off sideways along the bottom of the parchment. And this is the piece that launched 1,000 wild theories. Because some people looked at that strange southern landmass and declared, that's Antarctica, a continent that wouldn't be officially sighted until 300 years later, in the 1800s. And not just Antarctica. They claimed it showed the coastline of Antarctica as it looks beneath the ice, the way it would have appeared thousands of years ago before the ice sheets formed. How could a map from 1513 possibly show that? This is where the story exploded into legend, and we have to deal with it honestly, because the claims got enormous. In the 1960s, a professor named Charles Hapgood popularized the idea that the Piri Reis map proved the existence of a lost, advanced civilization, a forgotten people who had mapped the entire globe with sophisticated technology thousands of years before the ancient Egyptians, and whose secret charts were copied and recopied down the centuries until they reached Piri Reis. From there, the theories spiraled even further. Some suggested the map was evidence of ancient astronauts, aliens surveying the Earth from orbit, which would explain how the coastlines looked almost as if seen from above. It became one of the great cornerstones of Ancient Mysteries television, repeated for decades. A 1513 map that knew about ice-free Antarctica? It sounds airtight. So, is it true? No. And the real explanation, once you see it, is almost embarrassingly simple. And it teaches us something important about how all these impossible maps work. Look carefully at what that southern landmass actually is. The coast of South America is drawn well, and then, at the bottom of the page, it simply bends and continues sideways. Why? Because Piri Reis ran out of room. He was drawing on a limited piece of skin, and rather than stop, he did what many mapmakers of his era did. He bent the coastline to fit the space he had left. That mysterious Antarctic continent is, almost certainly, just the southern part of South America, squashed and rotated to fit the parchment. And here's the detail that demolishes the whole Antarctica theory. Piri Reis wrote notes directly on his map describing that southern land. He described it as a place that was warm, with great heat, and full of snakes. Warm. Full of snakes. That is a description of the jungles and coasts of South America. It is the exact opposite of the frozen, lifeless reality of Antarctica. The mapmaker himself told us in his own handwriting that this was a hot land of serpents, not a sheet of ice at the bottom of the world. The mystery, in other words, was solved by simply reading what the man wrote. But this leaves a much more interesting question hanging in the air. Even if Piri Reis didn't draw Antarctica, why did so many old maps show a giant continent at the bottom of the world, long before anyone went there? Because here's a fact that surprises almost everyone. For centuries, European maps confidently displayed an enormous southern continent that nobody had ever seen. They even gave it a name, Terra Australis Incognita, Latin for the unknown southern land. It sprawled across the bottom of world maps by the greatest cartographers of the age. And the truly mind-bending part? That continent was completely imaginary. Nobody had sailed there. Nobody had any evidence it existed. So why was it on the maps? The answer reveals how the human mind works, and it's beautiful. Ancient and Renaissance thinkers had a deep belief in balance and symmetry. They looked at the globe and reasoned like this. There's a huge amount of land up in the northern half of the world, Europe, Asia, all of it. Surely, they thought, there must be a matching mass of land down in the southern half to balance the planet, to keep it from being lopsided. It was almost a philosophical conviction. The world should be symmetrical. So they drew a giant southern continent purely out of logic and belief, with zero observation behind it. They invented a continent because it felt like one ought to be there. And here's the twist that makes this so fascinating. They were, in a sense, accidentally right. There is land down there. There's Australia. There's Antarctica. So for centuries, every time an explorer caught a glimpse of some southern coastline, the tip of South America, the shores of Australia, people would cry, "There it is! That's the edge of the great southern continent we always knew was there!" They were fitting real fragments into an imaginary frame. The mythical Terra Australis acted like a magnet for every scrap of southern discovery, pulling them all into one grand, invented landmass. So when you see an old map that seems to predict Antarctica or Australia, you're usually not looking at secret ancient knowledge. You're looking at a lucky guess, a continent imagined for reasons of pure symmetry that happened to have some real land in roughly the right place. The mapmakers weren't remembering a lost truth, they were guessing, and the planet happened to partly cooperate. It took the voyages of Captain Cook in the 1700s, sailing far enough south to prove there was no giant temperate continent, where they'd imagined one, to finally erase Terra Australis from the maps, and shrink it down to the real, icy Antarctica we know today. So that's one kind of impossible map, the lucky guess dressed up as ancient wisdom. But there's another kind, and it cuts to something much darker and more deliberate. Maps that were faked. The most famous example was, for decades, one of the most prized possessions of Yale University. It's called the Vinland map. Supposedly drawn in the 1400s, it showed something astonishing for a medieval European map. A chunk of the North American coastline, clearly labeled, sitting out in the Atlantic southwest of Greenland. If real, it would mean that Europeans knew about and had mapped America decades before Columbus ever set sail, that the Vikings, the Norse, had not only reached the New World but charted it, and that this knowledge had circulated in medieval Europe. When Yale unveiled it in 1965, it was a sensation, a genuine pre-Columbian map of America. It seemed to rewrite history. There was just one problem. It was a fake. From the very beginning, scholars were suspicious. Little details didn't match other medieval documents. The way the map connected to its companion texts was off. And then science closed in. Over the following decades, careful chemical analysis of the ink revealed the truth. The map was drawn with a pigment that contains a compound which wasn't manufactured until the 20th century. The ink, quite simply, could not have existed in the 1400s. In 2021, Yale's own experts declared the matter settled, stating flatly that the Vinland map is a fake, with no reasonable doubt remaining. It was a forgery, made in the modern era, designed to look ancient, and it had fooled experts and the public for half a century. So that's a clean case. Not a mystery at all, just a very clever lie. But here is where it gets genuinely fascinating, and where we have to be careful, because the forgery hides a real truth underneath it. The Vinland map was fake, but the thing it claimed was true. The Vikings really did reach North America centuries before Columbus. We know this not from any map, but from dirt and stone. In the 1960s, archaeologists digging at a windswept site called L'Anse aux Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland in Canada, uncovered the unmistakable remains of a Norse settlement. The foundations of buildings, a forge, workshops, tools, all distinctly Viking, dating to around the year 1000. That's roughly 500 years before Columbus. It is hard, physical proof that Norse explorers crossed the Atlantic, island hopping from Iceland to Greenland to the coast of the Americas, and built a settlement there. So the irony is exquisite. A forger faked a map to prove something that was actually genuinely true. The Vikings beat Columbus to the Americas by half a millennium. The forged map just wasn't the evidence. The real evidence was buried in the ground, waiting to be dug up. And that's a crucial lesson. A fake map and a real discovery can sit right next to each other, and you have to be careful never to confuse one for the other. Now, this pattern repeats with another famous case, one involving the other side of the world. Every so often, a claim surfaces that ancient Chinese fleets mapped the entire world, including the Americas, long before any Europeans. The most popular version of this idea centers on a map said to date from 1418, supposedly showing the Americas and other continents in surprising detail, which would mean Chinese explorers had circled and charted the globe decades before Columbus. And there is a real impressive history underneath this. In the early 1400s, China genuinely did launch enormous treasure fleets under a famous admiral, with ships far larger than anything Europe had, reaching across the Indian Ocean to Africa. That much is solid history, but the specific claim that they mapped the Americas and that the 1418 map proves it does not hold up. Historians who examined that map found serious problems. It appears to be a much later copy, and tellingly, it includes geographic details and styles that betray European influence, suggesting it was actually based on later European maps rather than predating them. The leading versions of this theory have been widely rejected by serious historians. It's the same trap as before, a thrilling claim, a real kernel of history about China's mighty fleets wrapped around a map that simply doesn't deliver what it promises. So if these maps aren't ancient secret knowledge and aren't all forgeries, what were old maps actually doing? To really understand, you have to step into the medieval mind, because their maps weren't trying to be what we think maps are. Look at a great medieval map of the world, what scholars call a mappa mundi, like the famous one at Hereford in England. To modernize, it looks bizarre and wrong. It's circular. There's almost no accurate coastline. The continents are squashed into strange shapes. But that's because the mapmaker wasn't trying to help you navigate from one place to another at all. These maps were spiritual and symbolic. They placed the holy city of Jerusalem right in the center because it was the spiritual heart of their world. They filled the edges with biblical scenes, mythical beasts, and monsters that were believed to lurk in unknown lands. The map was a picture of how the universe was meaningfully arranged, a kind of diagram of creation, not a tool for measuring distance. So when we look at an old map and judge it by whether it got the coastlines right, we're often asking the wrong question entirely. Many of these maps were never about geography in our sense. They were about telling you your place in a divine order. The errors aren't mistakes. They're a completely different purpose. So let's pull it all together, because once you see the full picture, the so-called impossible maps stop being supernatural and start being deeply, wonderfully human. How did old maps seem to show lands before they were discovered? It comes down to a handful of very down-to-earth explanations, working alone or together. Sometimes it was a lucky guess driven by logic, like an entire imaginary continent invented for the sake of symmetry that happened to have real land in the neighborhood. Sometimes it was the patient copying and combining of older maps so that hard-won knowledge from one explorer quietly traveled into someone else's chart, making a mapmaker look more all-seeing than he was. Sometimes a coastline was simply bent or stretched to fit the page, then mistaken by later eyes for a mysterious, unknown land. Sometimes a genuine ancient achievement, like the Vikings reaching America, left faint traces that real evidence later confirmed. And sometimes, frankly, it was a flat-out forgery, made to deceive. What it almost never was, when you actually investigate, is aliens, or a vanished super-civilization, or psychic foreknowledge. And honestly, the real story is the better one. Because these maps are a record of something genuinely extraordinary. Human beings, with no satellites and no aerial view, trying to piece together the shape of an entire planet from rumors, voyages, logic, faith, and sheer, stubborn imagination. They got things wrong. They guessed. They borrowed and copied and dreamed. And slowly, map by map, error by error, they dragged the true shape of the world into the light. That's not the work of ghosts or gods or aliens. That's the work of curious people, staring at the edge of the known world and refusing to leave it blank.